Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is History Lecture 27 on the history of the BFA degree. So I'm just going to jump right in. I have a number of things to say about history under different headings, and I have a really, depressing conclusion on the last slide. We'll see that when we get to it. So first of all, Thierry de Duve. He's a Belgian art historian that I talked about in lectures 13 and 14 of the Concepts series. And here's the chart that was reproduced in those lectures. So this is a chart that shows the history of art education according to this person, Thierry de Duve. On the left, in yellow, you have his 3 periods of art instruction. The top one there is labeled the 19th Century Academy. I have this table come up in the next slide with slightly larger letters, but I wanted to reproduce it just the way it was in those other lectures to start out with. So the first period is called the 19th Century Academy, and that is not the same as what I was calling the Romantic Academy. What that really means is more like what I was calling the French Academy. In other words, standard European art academies, the way they were from the end of the Renaissance all the way through the 19th century. It's what that means. The second period is the Bauhaus, exactly what I was talking about in the previous lecture. And the current period, he just calls it the current condition. I was calling it post-war art schools. So these are slightly different historical periods, but it really doesn't matter. They're very close. Okay, so here's a more legible version of that with the small print removed. So in the previous lecture, we were also talking about the change from the French Academy, when artists were taught to copy nature, and the Romantic academies, when artists were taught that all art is self-expression. In Thierry de Duve's chart, that appears here in the right-hand column. In the 19th Century Academy, as he calls it, one of the leading terms, he says, was imitation. That means like imitation of nature, copying nature, making naturalistic or realistic depictions is what that means. And then in the modernist Bauhaus, imitation was replaced by invention. So you can see that you're dealing here with more or less the same kind of thing that I was talking about last time. The change from the French Academy, in which people were taught to copy nature, that's imitation, to Romantic academies, or in this case the Bauhaus, in which people were taught that they should be inventive. So if you picture yourself in a student in the Bauhaus, Thierry de Duve's idea is that you would be, that invention would be one of the main things that you would be taught to try for, and not imitation. On the left column, there's a different change, which we haven't talked about yet. It's a change from talent to creativity. So talent, which is a word that he associates with earlier European academies. Talent is something that not everybody has. Some people have it, some people don't. But in the newer way of thinking, which he associates with modernism and the Bauhaus, talent has been replaced, and what really matters is creativity. That's much more democratic because everybody has creativity, even though some people don't have talent. So the first one is exclusive, and the second one is inclusive. De Duve was very critical about the condition of contemporary art schools. He started his own, by the way. He tried to start one in Paris, and then he started one in Brussels, and he wrote a book on the subject. He didn't like the way most art is taught these days, and that's why his bottom row is called the current condition. And it has words in it that are really not maybe the absolute best, and certainly not the most positive. The one on the lower left, attitude, is exactly the way it sounds, as in you have attitude. De Duve thinks that this is kind of empty. It's like a pose or a stance that people in the art world have. So it's a kind of pessimistic way of thinking of history, but it's an extremely interesting and useful chart anyway. So on that left-hand column there, once upon a time, some people would be said to have had talent, and they would go to art academies, and the rest of the people would do something with their lives other than art. Then there was a period in modernism when everyone could be creative. And even though creativity is still a word that's very much around, Dedeuve thinks it's more or less been replaced by attitude. So if you have an interesting attitude or a provocative attitude, that's what counts in art in Dedeuve's way of thinking. Okay, and then over to the right-hand row. So at first you had imitation or accurate copying of nature, naturalism, and so on. And then with the Bauhaus, you had the value change to invention, where you would be expressing yourself. And Dedeuve uses the word deconstruction to describe the current condition. Deconstruction is a philosophic movement, which I'll talk about in some other lectures. But what he means really here is just like destruction. He means that the values of imitating nature are long gone, and that we can no longer believe or be interested in the fact that artists express their inner lives. And so we're in a position of having destroyed those two most important values and having nothing to put in their place. So, pessimistic, but really useful, this chart, and I'll be coming back to it. It's one of the very few attempts to understand the history of the leading concepts of the BFA. Okay, into the history itself. So I have some historical detail here, as I said, but I think this kind of thing is useful to give a background. So BFA degrees are recent, but MFA degrees are even newer. BFA degrees can be traced back to the early 19th century. Institutions offered a diploma as the art qualification with a teaching certificate in North America up until World War II. Around 1938, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago offered the first BA degree, BFA degree in an art school. BA degrees were in universities only before that. Right after the Second World War, the School of the Art Institute led the discussion on accreditation of art schools, resulting in the formation of a professional organization that still exists, which assures that we are accredited. You get a proper college degree and all that. That's also something the School of the Art Institute did. And also after the Second World War, we offered the first MFA degree in a professional art school. And again, MFA degrees did exist before that in universities. And then most recently, there have been PhDs offered in studio art, so in the US, but they're all over the place in the rest of the world, and that's another subject. So if you can see that the BFA or degree, or as it used to be called, the BA degree, is quite an older institution. There were no, of course, BA degrees or MFA degrees in academies. So this all has to do with places that art was taught outside of academies. And that's why it begins in the early 19th century, as you see at the top row there, because the Romantic academies were the first ones to break the mold of the European French Academy model. BFA degrees have taught different things over the years. In that first period, they used to train essentially high school teachers to teach art up until fairly recently, up until World War II. Up to the 1930s, there was a lot of teaching of illustration. There are archives for the School of the Art Institute that where some student work is preserved, and there are also the graduation booklets of the graduation, and you can see a lot of illustration, especially commercial cartooning and printmaking, and a lot of artists went on to illustrate in magazines and newspapers up to around the 1930s. Up to the 1960s, a lot of art schools did craft and industrial design, and that's also the influence of the Bauhaus. So this emphasis that we have now on fine arts is relatively recent. It's really only since the 1960s that fine art became a focus. You can kind of picture what it was like in the early 20th century if you think that, like, in a typical class you would be studying cartoons, as in like Sunday comics kind of cartoons or magazine cartoons and stuff like that, and also industrial design, craft and industrial design. And then the whole idea of dropping skills, de-skilling, removing traditional media, removing prerequisites, moving to pass-fail, and all the rest of that. That's the late 60s, came in the late 60s. So this is by way of saying that that what we think of as the BFA is relatively recent, even though the degree itself goes way back. goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. There are different kinds of BFA degrees. They reflect also the history of the BFA, and some places are still teaching French Academy style art, and others carry on Bauhaus interests. So here are some examples of that. There are still French Academy model institutions in the United States that offer BFAs. They're usually called atelier schools. Atelier is a configuration where you study with a master, and there's a whole class will work together as they did in the European academies. There's more or less about 10 independent atelier schools in the United States. There are also what are sometimes called Bohemian craft intensive schools. These are ones that are modeled on the Bauhaus. So they're kind of like survivors of the Bauhaus. There's about 5 of those. And then, of course, you can get a BFA in a college or a university, and there's like 500 of those. So there's a ton of art departments in colleges and universities that'll give you a BFA. Professional art schools, like the School of the Art Institute, there's about 40. And then there are a lot of unaccredited institutions that I'll talk about a bit later. Here are just some examples of atelier schools for those of you who might be interested. These are more conservative because they're modeled on this academic French Academy kind of style. And I'm not going to read that as just for reference, but I'll show you an example. An atelier style school. There is something called the Atelier Studio Program. It's actually named that, which teaches naturalistic skills. And they have a journal, as you can see here. That's one of their first issues, Volume 1, Issue 2. That's a painting, of course, not a photograph. So their photograph lists their legacy artists, the ones that they model themselves on. That's Jacques-Louis David, that's the French revolutionary artist. Paul Delaroche is a 19th century painter, academic painter, and so is Gérôme. And then there's William McGregor Paxton, who's a 20th century painter. R.H. Ives Gamel, who I don't know, another one who's their founder, and Richard Lack, the founder of the Atelier School, I should say. This Atelier Studio Program used to be called Atelier Lack because he's the one who founded it. It's in Michigan. So that's an example of what's almost literally a French Academy style school where you can get an art degree. And here's some examples of Bohemian Craft Center School. These are the ones that are descended from the Bauhaus. And again, I'm not going to read this, but there are several of these that are still around. But you notice that the bottom 2 of these are not in business anymore. And the one at the bottom is probably the most famous, Black Mountain College. This was fairly short-lived. It was an attempt to put all of the arts, especially dance and poetry and theater, into the central position in a liberal arts education. So it was an attempt to rethink college as well as art school. Albers was the first art teacher there. He came straight from the Bauhaus to the Black Mountain College. This was a really influential institution with a lot of well-known artists who studied there, and there have been a number of attempts to study it and some attempts to replicate it. Most recently, there was an exhibition in Berlin in 2015 that included all of the archives which they sent over to Berlin, so you can study them in the exhibition and learn what the people who set up that exhibition were hoping to create another Black Mountain College. But it's proved kind of elusive. It was a very special moment in art instruction. And then as examples of unaccredited institutions, which were at the bottom of that, if you're interested in these, a really good book is Greg Chalette's book called Dark Matter, Art and Politics in the Age of Enterprise Culture. It's a source book, in a way, for non-accredited art institutions. There are about 30 of them or so, more or less, that are discussed in this book, and most of them are actually art projects, and only a few of them are unambiguously also teaching institutions. I'll give you an example, one that's not in Greg Chalette's book. Joan Marie Kelly, she's an artist who has a teaching job in Singapore. She's also an unaccredited teacher. And part of her art teaching, her activity of art teaching is also part of her art project. She teaches painting to disadvantaged people in various countries, and she's taught painting to sex workers in several different countries in Southeast Asia. So these are some pictures from her own website. So as an very much unaccredited, I mean, she's not trying to get accreditation, and she is teaching, and it is changing people's lives, so she hopes, and also at the same time, it's part of her art project to be doing that. A little bit more ambiguous and better known is the Bruce High Quality Foundation University, they call themselves, in New York City. It was founded in 2009. For those who find, quote, a PhD in art makes the blood run cold. So its university, quote unquote, is sometimes very parodic, like you see here, a life drawing class of a crucifixion, and sometimes also conservative, like you can also see here with the kind of, at least these students are actually learning naturalistic skills. At the same time, the people who run this, the Bruces, they call themselves, supposedly anonymous group of artists, have their own art practice, and in a sense, the Bruce High Quality Foundation University is an art project. So there are these various species, different flavors of the BFA outside of professional art schools, like the School of the Art Institute. So now comes my strange and, I suppose, depressing conclusion, although actually I don't find it depressing, but anyway, here it is, that no one knows what the BFA is. So this may not be especially comforting, but there actually is no official definition of the BFA. The MFA was defined in 1977, and I have a screen on that. And since the spread of MFA programs in the 1960s, the BFA has more or less generally been thought of as a time for students to experiment. So the basic idea is that you use your BFA years to try all sorts of things, as many different media as you can, all the different forms of expression that you can, and then you use the MFA years, if you do that, to try to consolidate your practice to get a voice, like, as you would with the apprentice to the master and the romantic academies, to try to get a manner or a style or a voice and so on. But the BFA is supposed to be a time of experimentation. However, that's just a general unofficial consensus, and there is actually no text that describes how teachers can know when the BFA is complete. When is your period of experimentation complete? These are just ideas that are sort of in the air. So in that sense, nobody knows what the BFA is. Actually, so I'm going to just end with this one little PS about the MFA. The original 1977 definition of the MFA is only a half a page long. And the wording that was adopted then in 1977 is still in place in the current version, which can be found online. And that definition uses a couple of terms that are themselves not very well defined. So in that 1/2 page definition, you can read that an MFA student should achieve, quote, professional competency. But that's not defined. An MFA student should have a, quote, ability to conceptualize. Again, not really clear exactly what that means, but there are lots of interpretations, of course, because from this little 1/2 page definition, lots and lots of curricula and syllabi have been elaborated. An MFA student should have a skillful execution of tools, materials, and crafts, which sounds a little bit like a BFA kind of thing to me, but is something that's a definition of the MFA. So the defining document is too short, and there's still no consensus on what the degree accomplishes other than professional preparation, because that's what the first line says. So, welcome, I guess, to the beginning of an undefined degree, the BFA, which is going to lead you on to another undefined degree, the MFA.